Hello, everybody, and welcome to Symmetry Live. This is Natasha Helfer, and with me, I've got several of my team members. So excited to have them. I've got Jenny Ellich, who's in Florida. Say hello.
Hello.
I've got
hello.
Jana Spangler, who's in Salt Lake City. Say hello.
Hi. Hello.
We've got our newest member of our team, Lindsay McFadden. Whoop, whoop.
Hi.
She's coming to us from Colorado. So hello, everybody. Super happy to have everyone. Just for those of you who don't know, we run a group practice, both with online and in-office services, both for mental health and wellness types of services. So if you're looking for therapy or wellness coaching, we can either probably help you or at least give you some good recommendations of where to go in your geographical area. Today, we are going to be talking about musings on identity and life cycle. We're going to go deep. But, you know, fate transitions is something that we work at a lot at Symmetry. Second half of life type themes is something that we work on a lot. And so we basically think about that through, you know, why do certain people head in certain directions versus other people head in others, right? And so I think, hold on just a minute, because I have a real life thing going on. Hey, teenagers in my house, quiet. I love you. Okay. So, anyway, I don't know why they have Fridays off. Oh yeah, COVID. Okay, never mind. That's a whole nother subject. So I think, you know, as people go through different developmental cycles of life, right? So we've got kind of like, when you think about development, you've got teenagers, you've got who are, you know, typically are doing things like challenging authority and thinking their parents are dumb and figuring out their own identity. And that kind of continues into young adulthood, right? College age and figuring out who they want to be. And then we kind of get into our nesting phase in our late 20s or 30s when we have little kiddos, and many of us marry or, you know, create home environments of our own. And then you move into midlife, where the nest doesn't need you quite as much and you're more independent. Although all of these things can change, obviously, depending on your own personal life experience. But you're usually in your 40s and 50s revisiting kind of your values and your life plans. And second half of life is around the corner. And then, you know, you've got your 60s and 70s where you may be empty nesters and grandparenting and reflecting and still maybe wanting to, you know, bucket list things that you kind of understand mortality is around the corner, right? And so all of that is happening along with a lot of other things. So I actually promised I wouldn't do this, but Jen, Jenna's like, you always ask me questions. Okay, I won't. But Jenna, your training kind of in spiritual development kind of takes a different approach, right? It's not just following a life cycle, which is a more psychological and kind of childhood, although it's also adult development theory. Yours kind of follows something a little bit different. So talk to us a little bit about kind of your how you see it a little bit differently than this traditional developmental view.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say it is different. I would say it's a different layer that I put on top of this developmental view, right? So along with the life cycle that we see with these different stages, there's also the lens that we bring to those different stages. So what I mean by that is, what am I aware of in my consciousness? Because the kind of development that I work with is more developmental consciousness, consciousness development. So it's, what am I aware of? Am I aware of just my own experience in the world? Am I able to take in somebody else's experience? Am I mostly focused and seeing things through a lens of the way my group does it, my family, my culture, my church, my religious views? Am I seeing things through a lens of this is the way it is done? Or am I leaning into more of an openness of, oh wow, someone else has had a completely different experience, and I'm able to really deeply listen and take that in and take that into consideration? So it really has to do with what kind of a lens. So if you're going through the stage of your life where you're raising children, you can do that from a lens of, this is the way that I do my life, and this is the right way to do life. And if everyone did it that way, that would all be great, right? Or sometimes it's, I have no idea what I'm doing. It doesn't have to be always like an idea of I've got it right, but it is through a lens of how much of the world am I taking in? Is it very personal to me, or am I taking in more? So it's a big lens that makes a big difference to how we experience these different stages. So yeah.
I was going to ask you about that. Is that like a progressive thing? Like, do you think people start at one lens and continually grow into a wider lens?
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of Fowler's Stages of Faith, the way that you're explaining that. And yes, like the further along you get in those stages, the wider your lens seems like it would be growing at the same time.
Yeah.
Is that the way it works?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Fowler is one of the developmental scientists that I would refer to in the research. So the research tells us that this is a stepwise thing. So, we start as babies with not even knowing we're something separate, right? And then we kind of figure out that we're separate from our parents. And then we realize, slowly we're kind of only aware of ourselves. Like if I play peekaboo with you, I have my eyes closed, I think you can't see me either, right? Mm-hmm. And then it widens to take in more and more, take in your family, your group, and it widens as we go. Now, some people seem to stay in a certain stage of consciousness throughout their lives. And I always like to make a point that development is not necessarily better. Mm-hmm. That people, whatever your lens, whatever you are taking in, you are going to have the capacity of having very fulfilling life, of being a very good person, of it's not necessarily better to have a wider lens. It just means you're going to have different views. It's going to bring some bonuses, and it's going to bring some bigger problems. So.
Well, I'm always glad when you say that, because I think both as Americans and even kind of like certain Christian cultures, many of us come from Mormonism, for example, we tend to be checklisters and doers. And so it's like, wait, there's another stage of development. I have to get there. And that's not really exactly how stages of development go. They're kind of these organic, highly subconscious types of things that are just kind of happening to us. It's not something, not that you can't, educate yourself and have some things shift through education. And yet it's not like, give me all the tasks so I can get to the next stage.
Exactly. And I also like to talk about it like, if I'm seeing, it's almost like being in maybe the same size room, you're just standing at different corners. So from over here, I may not be seeing what's behind the couch. From over here, I can see more. And that can be good, that can be bad, depending on what's behind the couch. So.
Right.
Yeah. It's just a different viewpoint.
I would think a lot of that might be influenced by the way or the culture or the community, let's say community, the community that you grew up with, right? So if you are in Utah, you're going to grow up with a very sort of homogenous type of community. If you're outside of Utah in a more diverse population, you're going to be naturally exposed to all of these different types of ideas, different ways of doing life, different ways of raising a family. You could go down the street, check in 10 different homes, you'll see 10 different ways of raising a family. And none of those are necessarily more right than others.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be a piece that influences is how many different people are you exposed to, and not only just who are you exposed to, but how much are you letting in their way of seeing things. Mm-hmm. Not just seeing, because you can be surrounded by a bunch of different kinds of people, but if you are still coming from a lens, your own lens, sometimes you're using that lens to judge them and to make sense of how they are doing things, rather than an openness that really gives equal value to and understands that they may be having an experience that is completely different from anything you've ever had.
So like a sense of curiosity, like, interesting. This is how you do life, and this is how I do life.
Yep.
Yeah, that's so
and
true.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
I was just going to say, for me, I grew up in a place that was not homogenous at all. I was totally the minority as a member of the Mormon church, but I still definitely had the lens that there was my way to do it, and this was the way they should be doing it. And I definitely, thought that, oh, I'm sorry, all you people have it wrong. But as I grew and developed, and I do think in this case, it was a good development to have a much broader lens as I got older. But yeah, for me, it didn't matter that I lived outside of Utah necessarily.
Yeah, and if I can
go ahead. I was just going to say that was an interesting point that you were making, Jana, before too. It's not like just because the developmental stage means that, like I said, teenagers oftentimes are going through this authority rebellion, doesn't mean all teenagers do. If you're in a more orthodox or cultural space where that's not even really allowed or rewarded or considered, you may actually be, because of your culture and your values and your upbringing, you may actually not go through certain what are considered more mainstream or normative developmental stages. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, actually, the thought I had was just thinking about something that I see a lot in these discussions, especially Lindsay brought up Feller stages of faith. And that's something that is we're becoming more and more aware of how that interacts with our LDS experience and faith journey. But one of the things that I have noticed is that some people feel like if I'm hitting some sort of a faith transition, that means that I'm having a different view, that in and of itself means I'm having a different view and I'm in a different stage. I actually think that I see faith transition happen differently if you have different stages of awareness. So sometimes a new stage brings on the faith questions. That I see that happening. I also see where it's just information that is challenging that brings on something, but our stage of consciousness is relatively the same. So what that might look like is that lens you're talking about, Lindsay, where this is the way I see the world and this is the way it's right. And like I mentioned earlier, if everyone knew what I knew, they would all be doing what I'm doing. But now that has switched for me and I've changed. And now I'm feeling like I'm seeing something new and I've totally rejected where I've come from. But if you're in that same stage of consciousness, you'll be in a place where it's like, well, if all those people who are still doing that faith thing knew what I knew, they'd all leave with me. That's the same stage of consciousness. So
you haven't developed.
No.
just because you've changed your beliefs doesn't mean that you've developed, which is why I like to tease everybody that you can be a black and white Christian thinker, you can be a black and white atheist, right? You can be a nuanced, Jehovah's Witness, you can be a nuanced, agnostic, right? But I think you're bringing a very interesting point that it's not just beliefs that shift, and why we can see even progressive or liberal people who you might think would be enlightened still be in very similar patterns of behavior with other humans as maybe more what we considered conservative or orthodox perspectives. Jenny, you were going to say something.
Jana took it in a different direction, so I'm trying to think of where
Go back to the other one.
I was going to say a lot of people who hit the kind of 40, a lot of people, not just people in faith transitions, are starting to question a lot of different things in their life. What do I want to do for the next 30, 40 years of my life? Do I want the same career? Do I want the same, do I still want to live where I'm living? Lots of different types of questions are coming up. And if you're also going through a little bit of an identity crisis, or if your lens that we've been talking about has been expanding, I guess I'm trying to think. What you're saying now is that if your lens is going to expand, are you also saying that those shifts can be easier than if it doesn't?
Oh man, I think that's a whole different question. I don't know that it has anything to do with ease. It's just different. It's just different.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But what I was going to say, I noticed that some people who go through these transitions, sometimes if they feel like they miss one of the earlier cycles, of your life cycle that we just talked about and your identity, you might revisit some of that briefly for a little bit. So let's say you had a very typical Mormon upbringing and you went to BYU, and then in your 40s, you're going through a faith transition. You might revisit some of the things that you see other people going through in their 20s when they go to college. So because you missed that whole part briefly. And we want to stay those, you know, because you're in your 40s, so you still need to bring all of your wisdom with you as you revisit some of those earlier cycles. Yeah, that's a lot of our work too, trying to help people navigate that too.
I think that's kind of funny too, because I see people doing that and it doesn't even seem to be like it's a conscious choice. Like they're like, oh, well, I never got drunk in college, so I better check that off my list. It's almost just like, it's like our natural tendency to just revert to that stage that we kind of skipped over.
And that's very much the Ericksonian theory, right? Is that if your life circumstances did not allow for you to go through developmental stages correctly, whatever that means, then you will be stuck, quote unquote, in certain ways. And you will have to, one of the tasks of, emotional intelligence and mental health will require you to revisit some of those developmental stages. So whether or not you buy into that theory, is a whole nother thing. But so things that can get in the way of you going through developmental stages of life are maybe certain strict cultural norms, abusive parents, personality disordered parents, all kinds of environmental stressors, like you think about minority stress, or you think about refugees, or you think about wartime, whatever's interrupting kind of what would be considered a normative life cycle, which is hard to define, I think, because what is normal? I mean, most life stories have quite a bit of, variety of trauma, of betrayal, of things not going exactly right. And at some level that is normal. Life isn't supposed to be this, super easy journey. It's going to come with its challenges, regardless of where you come from or who you are. So anyway, this has really been an interesting little discussion. Any final thoughts? I mean, really, we're just musing. It's just how identity and development and stages of consciousness all kind of fit into our journeys. And I think what we're trying to get at is don't allow for you to get stuck in assumptions or blame games or assuming that you know what's best, especially for everybody else, because a lot of these things are bigger than just your current state of consciousness, right? And that, I think, is something that's hard to muster, because I like to think I'm smart. I like to think I'm completely aware of what I'm doing and what I'm about. And so, but there's a lot of stuff from my background and my personality and my biology and my temperament that feed how I function and show up in the world, and I think that's true of all of us. Any other final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that I think it's important to keep in mind, like, I love these big framings. I talk about them and yeah, that sounds so great. But each individual, it's so complex, with the psychological development, you put these stages of consciousness, and there are like a lot of different ways to even, this is so high level, but personality, all the things you mentioned, Natasha, they all inform our experience in the world. And I just like to help people understand that, all of this may be informing it, and you may like that map and you may not, and it may describe you, it may not. These are kind of generalities. But wherever you are, there is that combination of our upbringing, of our experience, of who we are, that has brought us to exactly where we are today. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that or inherently virtuous about that. It's just a lens to help us understand where we are, so that we can then, in the work that I do with people in our coaching work, figure out how best to just be who we are and express ourselves in the world. So anyway, I just, sometimes we love these things because we love to make meaning, and I love them and I love to talk about them, but don't take them too seriously at the
Right.
same time. There's so much that goes into the variety of who you are.
Yeah, for sure.
And I love that you said that too, Janet, that it just is. It just is, like, it's okay. And to be okay with who you are, where you are, because I think we tend to kind of berate ourselves if we did happen to revisit the college years or what, it's okay. It's all okay. Where you are is where you are.
Ooh, lost your camera. Totally agree with you, ladies. It's been fun.
This has been fun. It's always fun. So join us in the future, Symmetry Live on Fridays, typically around lunchtime, depending on what zone you are in. It's usually about 10:30, 10:45 Mountain Standard Zone that we try to do this. And leave us comments. Give us your thoughts. What do you agree with us on? What do you disagree? What do you think we missed? If you have questions you'd like us to address in the future, please make sure you leave those in the comments thread as well, or personally message one of us and we'll make sure and address that. And I hope everybody has a great weekend. So take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.